there's this there's a difference between like the medical model and like the community healing model. So I was originally from New York. I moved out to Colorado a few years ago, not having heard of the successful campaign to get psilocybin to be the lowest law enforcement priority in the city of Denver, but I had no idea of the efforts that were coming. For example, Measure 109 in Oregon passing the psilocybin Services Act, and then in Colorado expanding on that to include both legal protections for community healing. It's decriminalized largely, but lots of personal possession laws are no longer criminal offenses. So there's this access through a community healing model, which kind of PIR sort of fits into, but we don't want to necessarily position ourselves just yet with actual direct service facilitation. Um, it's kind of liberating the idea of healing and taking it out of this highly medicalized, hierarchical, patient provider dichotomy. And we don't really know if that's necessarily a good thing, but we're liberating access where for a long time people would have had to go to a doctor, go to a rehab center. With some of these psychedelics, like mushrooms, for example, it can grow very easily and very abundantly. So people are kind of seizing upon these ideas about microdosing, and having recreational experiences with friends that are very intentional and designed to not necessarily be about getting fucked up. And people are experiencing profound results out of that. We don't really know what the exact mechanism by which psychedelics are producing this change for people with addiction. We have some theories, and there's growing bodies of evidence around this, but what the tragedy of the war on drugs, sadly, is we're near 3/4 of a century of just the lack of sophisticated knowledge. So we're really just kind of on the front end of what is going to be that. But as you said, the deaths of despair in the United States and in Canada certainly are only getting worse, and people are dying at horrific numbers, and behavioral addictions are becoming really problematic. So the idea of having to go through a very expensive, time-consuming thing in a traditional treatment model that may not resonate with you, I think is quickly becoming an outdated idea, and people are embracing this new possibility.
Hmm. Yeah, with this need for solutions, um, I think we see interesting things happening um, from a broad. Sorry, there's a motorcycle. I'm going to repeat what I just said. As we see these different solutions kind of emerging, I think we're seeing people ask some interesting questions about them. So when we look at psychedelics specifically, um, a question that I was going to ask you, and funnily enough, you said that you've had this question a lot, um, and that is, which drug is better for which particular ailment or maladaptive coping mechanism? And I think by the end of the conversation, we both agreed, this isn't really a great question because it's oversimplifying. It's oversimplifying the conversation. Um, so, what's the biggest problem with this kind of question when it comes to this subject?
Yeah, I think my when I first got interested in psychedelics in like towards the end of high school, I very much embraced the idea of like the so-called psychedelic renaissance. And what that meant was, MAPS and the Hefter Research Institute were going through a nonprofit strategy to develop MDMA and psilocybin through the FDA. So it is a very clinical, medicalized framework, but really you have to play that game, right? If you're going through the allopathic medical model of drug development, you have to tie a symptom to a specific indication. And then with that indication, you have to test the drug against placebo to see if it was more effective. So obviously, I'm not like in dispute of that strategy per se, but when it comes to the actual mechanism that is eliciting change, we all know that a peak experience on LSD can be very similar to a peak experience on psilocybin or DMT or even MDMA. I mean, these are vastly different, in many cases, pharmacological substances, but occasionally with the similar containers of it, you can see it produce very similar effects. You obviously with DMT, you might have something that just doesn't last as long. So when you break out of the confines of like the clinical research protocols, these heavily rigid and very tightly regulated sort of systems, you just sort of meet people, and people have a personal anecdotal story. It's obviously hard to mainstream that and implement that into a care delivery model. I mean, I'm a licensed addiction counselor. I work in traditional psychotherapy, as well as alternative models, thankfully here in Colorado, and with legal access to ketamine. So I kind of have to play into that dynamic a little bit just because of what's restricted in its access. But for the emerging kind of community healing models that are getting more and more momentum and success behind them, I think there's going to eventually be a moment where we have to reckon with what is it that people are going to look for in a community ayahuasca healing circle versus a camping trip with friends where they take some mushrooms, or even, MDMA at a music festival taken in a specific intention. So I find it less important to necessarily wonder about which indication, I guess, with the only caveat of Ibogaine, right? And we've been on this Ibogaine podcast with hardly talking about Ibogaine. I mean, as your listeners know a lot, we don't really have to dwell on that per se, but Ibogaine does seem to have some specific miraculous effects with a wide variety of substance use disorders. Obviously, the known one about attenuating opiate withdrawal, but even for stimulants or alcohol or benzodiazepines, it's not a good detox for those kinds of things, but it does produce effects on the brain that are far more reparative than other things. And yet we're really just starting to develop the evidence base to support that.